I remember the summer of 1998 like it was pressed into my skin. I was 27 back then, old enough to know better than to do something stupid, but still restless enough to go off alone just to test myself. I had borrowed my uncle's old pickup truck and drove 6 hours north into the forests of Montana. I had this idea of staying a week in a cabin I found through a friend of a friend. It wasn't a vacation rental or anything polished. It was just a small hunting cabin that hadn't been used in years. I wanted space away from people, away from work, away from the constant hum of everything. The drive itself felt endless. The paved road eventually turned into gravel, then into a narrow dirt path with brush scraping against the sides of the truck. I had written down landmarks because there was no chance of cell service out there. A rusted mailbox with no post, a crooked pine tree with lightning scars down its trunk, an old cattle gate hanging loose on one hinge. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became, like the air itself was heavier. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller than I imagined. The roof sagged in places, the wood siding was gray and splintering, and the single window on the front was cloudy with dust. Still, it stood, and it was mine for the week. I unloaded my things: sleeping bag, food, water jugs, a small camping stove, and carried them inside. The cabin smelled like damp wood and mouse droppings. The floor creaked under my boots, and in the corner I saw a pile of old newspapers from the late 80s stacked like someone had just left them. I spent the first day cleaning up. I swept away cobwebs, cleared dead insects from the windowsill, and aired out the place as best I could. The door only closed if I lifted it a little and jammed the bolt into place. The back of the cabin opened onto the tree line, and behind that the forest rose like a wall. I had this uneasy feeling, not fear exactly, but awareness, like I was stepping into something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. By the time night fell, the woods outside had swallowed every trace of daylight. I lit my lantern and sat at the small wooden table with a can of soup. The silence was deep enough that I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I told myself this was what I wanted: silence, solitude. But lying on the floor later, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the sound of the cabin creaking. Every small shift in the wood felt like footsteps. Every gust of wind against the walls felt like someone brushing past. On the second night, rain began falling. At first it was steady, almost calming, but as it went on, the sound grew heavier, drumming on the roof like fists. I couldn't sleep, so I sat up and watched the lantern light flicker. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside. Not rain, not branches, but something moving. A crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, then nothing. I told myself it was an animal. Out here it had to be. Still, I couldn't bring myself to open the door and check. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked at the muddy ground around the cabin. First, I saw nothing. Then my eyes caught it. Imprints in the mud, not boots exactly, but the clear shape of shoes. Human shoes. They weren't mine. The tread was different, thinner, and the steps circled the cabin. I followed them a few feet before they vanished into the brush. My stomach tightened. I had been careful, made sure nobody followed me out this far. There were no other cabins for miles. The idea that someone had been walking around mine in the night made my skin prickle. I kept going with my routine anyway, though my nerves were tighter. I chopped some kindling, tried to fish in the stream nearby, cooked rice on the stove. But all day I felt watched. It was a weight on the back of my neck, the kind that made me turn around again and again even when nothing was there. That night I barely slept. I kept my lantern lit and sat with my back against the wall, my hunting knife beside me. The rain had stopped, but the woods outside were alive with sound. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the door rattle, just a faint shake like someone testing it. My throat went dry. I stayed frozen, staring at the door, every muscle locked. The bolt held. After a minute, the sound stopped, but I didn't close my eyes again. By morning, I stepped outside to check again. More footprints, this time fresher, circling closer, like whoever it was had walked around and around the cabin. My hands shook as I traced the prints to where they disappeared into the trees. Whoever it was, they hadn't left. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the truck was half a mile down the trail, parked where the ground was firm enough. If I carried everything back, it would take 2 trips. That meant leaving my things behind unattended, or worse, leaving myself exposed. So I stayed. I kept the door bolted, stayed inside most of the day, listening. My water was running low, but I told myself I'd manage. I sharpened the knife, checked my small hatchet, kept them both close. On the 5th night, it got worse. I had dozed off for a few minutes when a noise jolted me awake. The door shaking harder than before, someone pulling at it. The sound of wood straining filled the cabin. I scrambled to my feet, knife in hand, heart pounding so hard I thought my chest would burst. Then silence again. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, until finally the sky outside lightened. When I stepped out at dawn, the footprints were back. Dozens of them now, pressed deep into the mud, circling in messy loops. Whoever it was had spent hours out there, watching, waiting. My chest felt hollow as I followed them toward the trees. They stopped at a point where the brush thickened, and beyond that the forest floor was disturbed, like someone had been sitting there for a long time, hidden. That was it for me. I gathered everything in a rush: food, stove, sleeping bag, my pack. I didn't care about neatness. I hauled it all down the path to the truck, stumbling, sweating, every sound in the forest making me snap my head around. When I reached the clearing where I had left the truck, my heart nearly dropped. Mud covered the tires, fresh. Someone had been there too. The driver's side door had muddy handprints near the handle, smeared like they had been pulling at it. I threw everything in the back, climbed in, and turned the key. The truck coughed, then started. Gravel spat from under the tires as I tore down the dirt track. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't look in the mirrors. I drove until the dirt turned to gravel, gravel to pavement, pavement to highway. Even now, years later, I think about it. The footprints, the handprints, the sound of someone testing the door in the dark. I never saw who it was, never got a face, but I know someone was out there every night, circling closer and closer. I think about how flimsy that bolt really was, how easily it could have given way. I never went back to that cabin. I never told my uncle where I'd been. I never wanted to explain why I drove home with my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. All I know is that someone knew I was there, someone had been watching, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I'd be here to tell it. I hadn't planned on driving past that cabin again. It had been years since the divorce, years since I had even let myself think about the time I spent there with him. But life has a strange way of pulling you back to places you swore you'd never go near again. That day, I was driving through a rural stretch of northern Wisconsin, the kind of place where the roads cut straight through miles of thick pine forest, and the air always smells like damp earth mixed with resin. It was late October of 2017. I was 37 then, and the daylight was already folding into a dull gray that made the woods feel endless. I had taken a back route to avoid the highway construction, and I didn't realize until the trees opened up that I was on the road that passed his cabin. The cabin sat about 50 yards back from the road, half hidden by the rise of land and the drooping branches of old pines. It looked smaller than I remembered, darker too, like the years had pressed down on it and squeezed the life out of the wood. The roof sagged at the edges, and patches of the siding had peeled away, leaving the raw boards exposed. The porch where we used to sit with coffee was littered with leaves and branches, and the front window had a spiderweb crack across it. For a moment, I thought maybe it was abandoned. I pulled the car over onto the gravel shoulder. My hands were cold even though the heater was running, and there was a strange tightness in my chest. I hadn't seen that place since the summer of 2012, the year I walked out. He'd bought the cabin when we were still married, a one-story structure built in the early 70s with no insulation worth mentioning, and a wood stove that always smoked no matter how carefully you stacked the logs. It was supposed to be a getaway, a place for weekends and fishing trips, but for me it became a place where silence dragged on too long and tension filled the rooms like heavy air. The thought of him still using it seemed unlikely. He was the kind of man who left things to rot once he got bored, and I couldn't imagine him keeping up with repairs. But something about the cabin still felt alive. Not alive in a mystical way, just occupied, as though it hadn't been forgotten. There was a plastic trash bin tipped on its side near the porch steps, and a faint track of tire ruts led off the dirt drive. I told myself I'd just take a closer look, just enough to satisfy whatever curiosity had rooted itself in me. I shut the car door quietly, even though no one was around to hear it, and walked toward the cabin. The grass and weeds in the yard were tall and stiff, crunching under my boots. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though I couldn't see any from the chimney. As I came up the steps, the boards flexed under my weight. The front door was closed, but the lock looked scratched, the paint chipped away like it had been forced at some point. My reflection warped in the cracked window, and for a second I thought I saw movement inside, just a shifting of shadows near the back wall. I hesitated, my throat dry. It wasn't my place anymore. I had no right to be here, but the curiosity gnawed at me harder. I turned the knob slowly. To my surprise, it opened. The hinges creaked, the kind of sound that carries far in the silence of the woods. The air inside was colder than outside, stale with the smell of damp wood and old smoke. The layout was exactly as I remembered. To the left, the small living area with the stone fireplace. Straight ahead, the narrow kitchen with its yellowed linoleum floor. To the right, the hallway that led to the two small bedrooms and the bathroom. It was like stepping back into a place I had tried to erase from memory. Dust coated everything, but it wasn't thick. Someone had been here not long ago. On the counter, there was an empty beer bottle with a ring of condensation dried around it, not more than a few days old. The wood stove door hung open slightly, and inside, the ashes were gray and fine, recent. I felt my heartbeat rise into my throat. I wasn't supposed to be there. Whoever had been staying there could come back any minute. Maybe it was him, maybe it wasn't. The thought of seeing his face again, after everything, after the way things ended, it made my stomach twist. But instead of leaving, I kept moving. My feet seemed to guide me down the hallway, the floorboards groaning with each step. The bedroom at the end of the hall had been ours. I remembered lying awake on that mattress, listening to him breathe beside me, staring at the wooden beams above, wondering if I'd ever get free. The door to that room was half shut. I nudged it open with my fingertips. The room smelled faintly of mildew and old fabric. The bed frame was still there, though the mattress had been dragged half off it, like someone had moved it roughly. There were clothes on the floor, not folded or stored, just scattered. Jeans, flannel shirts, socks stiff with dirt. Some of them looked like his style, but others were different sizes, too small for him. That unsettled me more than anything else. I noticed something else. The back window had been covered with a sheet of plywood, nailed in from the outside. Whoever had done it hadn't wanted anyone looking in or out. A sharp sound snapped me from my thoughts. Came from outside, near the treeline. A dry crack like a branch breaking under weight. My skin prickled instantly. I moved back into the hallway, careful not to make noise. The sound didn't come again, but the silence afterward was heavier than before, pressing against the walls. I thought about leaving right then, but I made the mistake of glancing into the second bedroom, the smaller one we never used much. What I saw froze me. Against the wall was a mattress on the floor, newer than the old one in the main room. On it was a pile of blankets, a duffel bag half open, and a plastic grocery sack full of canned food. Someone was living here, not visiting, living. And judging by the state of the food and the folded blankets, they were here recently. That realization hit me like a weight in my chest. This wasn't just some forgotten cabin anymore. It was someone's hideout. I turned and moved quickly back toward the front door. Every step felt like it echoed too loudly. My throat burned with the need to breathe faster, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I reached the porch and stepped down into the yard, my eyes scanning the tree line. That's when I noticed it. Another car, a rusted-out sedan, half hidden behind the shed at the edge of the property. I hadn't seen it when I walked up. Whoever it belonged to could still be here, maybe watching me already. I didn't wait to find out. I ran across the grass, my boots slipping on the damp patches, and climbed into my car. My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys once before jamming them into the ignition. The engine coughed, then roared to life, and I pulled away fast, gravel spitting out behind me. In the rearview mirror, the cabin shrank quickly, swallowed by the trees. But just before the bend in the road cut it from sight, I caught something that made my stomach drop even further. There was a figure on the porch, standing still, watching the road. I couldn't make out details, it was too far, but I knew it wasn't him. The shape was wrong, slimmer, younger maybe, someone else entirely. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway. My chest ached from holding my breath, and my hands were stiff from gripping the wheel so hard. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station 30 miles away, where the lights and people made me feel like I had broken back into the real world. That night, lying awake in my apartment hours away, I kept replaying the scene. The clothes, the food, the car hidden behind the shed, the figure on the porch. Someone was using that cabin now. Someone who didn't want to be found. I had stumbled into their space, and they had seen me. I never told anyone. Not my friends, not my family. I just avoided that entire stretch of road after that day. But sometimes, when I'm driving in the dark and the trees close in, I feel the same pressure in my chest, the same weight of being watched. And I know, clear as day, that if I had stayed even a few minutes longer, if I had opened one more door or lingered in one more room, I might not have made it back to my car. The cabin wasn't his anymore. It belonged to someone else now. And whoever they were, they had been watching me leave. It was the fall of 1996 when I decided to take a short trip out of the city and spend a few days away from all the noise. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, and I needed some space to think clearly. A friend of mine told me about a small cabin he had once seen near an old graveyard just outside a small town in Kentucky. It wasn't listed on maps, but he said it could be rented out by people who knew the right locals. It sounded unusual, but I didn't mind. I wanted quiet, and a place near a graveyard almost guaranteed that. People would stay away. I drove down a narrow 2-lane road that stretched endlessly through the hills, the woods closing in from both sides. The closer I got, the fewer houses I saw. By the time I reached the cabin, the last sign of civilization was several miles behind me. The cabin stood near a clearing, tucked against the tree line. The graveyard sat just a short walk beyond, the rows of tilted and weathered stones barely visible between the tall grass. It looked like no one had touched it in years. The cabin itself was small, with one room, a wood stove, a cot, and a table pushed against the wall. The boards creaked when I stepped inside, and the windows were streaked with dirt. There was no power, just a lantern and a pile of firewood stacked against the outside wall. Felt old but sturdy enough for a few nights. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, went for a walk through the woods, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. When night came, the silence was heavier than I expected. No cars, no voices, no faint buzz of city life in the distance. Just crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the faint sound of leaves shifting in the wind. I slept lightly, waking up several times to the sounds of small animals moving around outside. The second day, I decided to walk through the graveyard. It was larger than it looked from the cabin. The stones were uneven, some broken, many leaning. Names and dates had been worn smooth by time. The newest markers I could find were from the 1930s. The rest were older, some going back to the late 1800s. A few of the graves had sunk slightly, creating shallow depressions in the ground. The whole place smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. By evening, a heavy fog rolled in from the woods and settled over the ground, wrapping around the trees and stones until the graveyard almost vanished from sight. It gave me an uneasy feeling, so I stayed inside the cabin, stoking the fire and reading a book I had brought. The fog pressed against the windows, and the air grew colder than the night before. Later, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it, a faint crunch of gravel or dirt outside the cabin. I froze. My first thought was that it was just a deer, maybe moving through the clearing. But then it came again, slow, deliberate steps on the ground. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The fire had burned low, leaving the room dim and quiet. My heart thudded in my chest. The steps stopped just outside, near the front wall of the cabin. Minutes passed, and nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal and laid back down. But I didn't sleep much after that. The third day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the afternoon walking further into the woods, following deer trails until I nearly lost my way back. When I returned, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Near the edge of the graveyard, the grass looked freshly disturbed. A patch of dirt, maybe 3 or 4 feet long, had been dug up, leaving a shallow trench. I crouched down to look closer. It wasn't like an animal had been digging. It was too clean, too straight. The dirt was piled neatly on one side. The fog came again that night, thicker than before, swallowing the trees and smothering the cabin in silence. As I sat near the fire, I heard the steps again. This time, there was no mistaking them for an animal. They moved slowly, circling the cabin, stopping every few seconds, then starting again. The boards of the porch creaked as weight pressed down on them. I held my breath, waiting for a knock, a voice, anything, but it never came. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the window, the fog was so thick I couldn't see past the porch. Nothing moved. I went back to the cot and stayed awake until dawn, gripping a heavy piece of wood I had pulled from the pile. By morning, the ground outside the porch showed faint impressions in the dirt. Not boots, not shoes, just shallow, uneven marks that almost looked like bare feet dragging through the soil. I told myself it could have been a trick of the fog, water dripping from the roof, or animals passing through, but deep down I knew better. I thought about leaving that day, but stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I had 2 nights left, and I could handle it. I tried to keep busy, chopping some of the stacked wood smaller, boiling water for coffee, reading, and forcing myself not to stare at the graveyard. But as the sun went down, my nerves grew tighter. That night was worse than the others. I had barely put out the lantern when the noises began. Not just footsteps this time, but something heavier, scraping against the side of the cabin, dragging sounds across the porch. At one point, it rattled the door, testing it. My breath caught in my throat. The old lock held, but I sat frozen on the cot, clutching the wood like a weapon. Hours passed with the sounds circling, coming and going, always just outside the thin walls. At some point, exhaustion dragged me into a half-sleep. When I opened my eyes again, the first light of dawn was pushing through the fog. Everything was silent. I stepped outside, careful, and looked around. The clearing was still. The graveyard sat in its place. But then I noticed the dirt again. Another patch dug up, not far from the first. The soil was damp, freshly turned. That was enough. I packed my things as quickly as I could. I didn't eat, I didn't clean up. I just shoved everything back into my bag and loaded the car. My hands shook as I shoved the keys into the ignition. As I pulled out of the clearing, I looked one last time toward the graveyard. The fog was thinning, but I could still make out the fresh mounds of dirt, two now, dark against the pale ground. The rows of stones stood silently behind them, leaning in the same crooked way as before. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway with the sound of other cars around me. My body felt weak, like I had been holding my breath for days. Even now, when I think about it, I know what I saw. Someone had been digging those graves. Someone had been circling the cabin night after night, waiting in the fog. And I had been the only living person out there. I never went back, and I never told my friend about what I found. The memory of those footsteps, the sound of them dragging through the dirt, is still sharp in my mind. I don't know who was out there or what they were doing, but I know one thing for sure: I left just in time. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have come back. I had been planning the trip for weeks. It was the fall of 2014, and I was 29 at the time. I had saved up some vacation days and decided I'd spend a long weekend alone in the woods of northern Minnesota. A coworker of mine owned a small hunting cabin that hadn't been used much since his father passed away, and he told me I could stay there if I wanted some peace and quiet. The idea of being cut off from everything, just me, the trees, and the cold autumn air, sounded exactly like what I needed. The drive out was long. It was about 4 hours north of Duluth, and the farther I went, the more the paved road shrank into cracked asphalt, then narrowed into gravel, and finally into nothing but dirt. My little truck bounced along uneven ruts, and I kept checking the GPS signal before it died altogether. By the time I reached the trailhead where I was supposed to park, my phone had no service. I wasn't worried. I had expected that. I hiked the last half mile to the cabin with my backpack, rifle, and a small duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The air was sharp and crisp, and I could see my breath in front of me. The woods were so quiet that my boots crunching against the frosted leaves sounded like gunfire. The cabin sat in a small clearing, leaning slightly, as if the years had pushed it to one side. It wasn't much. 2 rooms, a wood stove, a bunk bed, and a small table with 2 chairs. Dust had settled into every crack, and the place smelled faintly of damp wood and mice. Still, it was shelter, and I liked that it felt forgotten. After settling in, I spent the first evening walking the tree line and getting familiar with the land. The sun went down early, and by 6 the woods were already shadow-soaked. Back inside, I lit a lantern, built a small fire in the stove, and cooked a can of stew. The silence pressed in on me, but it was the kind of quiet that felt good, like a blanket. When I finally laid down in the bunk, the fire crackling low, I felt calm. I remember thinking it might be one of the best weekends I'd had in years, but the second night changed everything. I had gone out hunting that day and returned with nothing. I was more tired than I expected, my legs heavy from pushing through the brush. I made a fire, ate, and sat on the porch in the dark for a while, listening to the distant rustle of animals in the woods. Around midnight, I crawled into bed. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I knew I was awake again, my eyes wide in the dark. I didn't know why at first, only that something had pulled me out of sleep. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim. Then I heard it. First, I thought it was just an animal, a crunch of leaves outside, near the tree line. But the steps weren't hurried, like a deer bounding, and they weren't light, like a raccoon or fox. They were slow, heavy. One step, then another, deliberate and steady. The sound circled the cabin, stopping now and then starting again. My throat went dry. I told myself it had to be a bear. That made the most sense. A curious black bear sniffing around, maybe smelling the food I had cooked earlier. I reached for my rifle, leaning against the wall by the bed, and gripped it tight. For a long time, the steps moved around outside, crunching, pausing, crunching again. Then, finally, silence. I lay there for what felt like an hour, barely breathing, until my eyes burned from staying open. Slowly, exhaustion dragged me under again. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from dew, and the leaves around the cabin were pressed down, showing clear impressions. They weren't paw prints. They were boots. Large boots, the tread deep in the earth. Whoever had been walking around had circled the cabin more than once. My stomach knotted when I saw them. I hadn't heard a vehicle, and the nearest road was miles away. I told myself maybe it was a hunter passing through, someone lost or curious. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The day passed slowly. I tried to hunt again, but my head wasn't in it. Every crack of a branch made me look over my shoulder. I ended up back at the cabin hours before sunset, double-checking the door's flimsy lock. That night, I stayed awake longer, sitting at the table with the rifle across my lap, the lantern throwing shadows against the wooden walls. Midnight came, and just like the night before, I heard them. The steps, crunch, crunch, moving through the leaves. This time, they were closer, circling slower, like whoever it was knew I was awake. My palms were slick on the rifle stock. The steps stopped at the front door. The boards of the porch creaked under weight. I stared at the handle, waiting for it to turn. It never did. After what felt like forever, the boards groaned again, and the steps moved away. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. The problem was, the trail back to my truck passed through thick woods, and the idea of walking that distance knowing someone might be out there watching me made my chest tighten. I decided to wait until midday when the sun was highest and then go. I packed everything, kept the rifle ready, and at noon I stepped out. The woods felt wrong, too still. I walked fast, my boots crunching loud against the dirt path, scanning the trees. Halfway back to the truck, I saw something that stopped me cold. On the side of the trail, nailed into a tree about chest height, was a dead rabbit. His body was split open, blood dried down the bark. The way it was placed didn't look like an accident or a predator. It was deliberate, a message. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my teeth. I didn't stop to think. I ran the rest of the way. Branches slapped my arms, and I nearly tripped twice, but I kept going until I broke through the last line of trees. My truck was still there, but the driver's side window was cracked. I sprinted to it, threw my gear in the back, and climbed inside. The seat smelled faintly of smoke, like someone had sat there recently. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I tore down the dirt road, the truck bouncing hard over ruts. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement again, miles away. I pulled over once, gripping the wheel with shaking hands, and sat there staring at the empty road. Whoever had been in those woods wasn't just passing through. They had been watching me, circling the cabin, leaving signs, waiting. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I never told my coworker what I saw. I just gave the cabin key back and said thanks. That was the last time I ever stayed alone in the woods. Even now, years later, when I go hunting with friends, I can't stop myself from checking the tree line, scanning for boots in the leaves, because I know someone was out there, and I know they weren't done with me. I was 28 when I decided to take a short break from work and spend a weekend hiking alone. It was the late summer of 1997, hot during the day but cool and damp in the evenings. I lived in northern Wisconsin at the time, not far from stretches of deep pine forest where people rarely wandered. I thought it would be good for me to get away from phones, noise, and the constant buzz of the town. I packed light, just a backpack, some food, water, and a cheap sleeping bag. I had no plans to camp inside anything, just under the stars, maybe with a small fire. I started out early in the morning, walking into the woods from an old logging road that had long been closed. The air smelled sharp with pine sap, and the ground was soft with needles and moss. I followed a deer path most of the day, hearing little more than the crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a twig. By mid-afternoon, I was far from any sign of the town. The sun pressed heavy through the trees, and I stopped to drink water and rest. That was when I noticed the outline of something through the brush. At first, I thought it was just an old shed or maybe a hunting blind. When I pushed through the brambles, I realized it was bigger. A cabin. It sat low and crooked, its wood almost black from rot and weather. The roof sagged in the middle, and half the chimney had collapsed, leaving broken bricks scattered in the weeds. A rusted stovepipe jutted out of one side, bent at an angle. There were no trails leading up to it, no sign that anyone had come near it in years. The front steps had sunk into the ground, tilting toward the earth, and one of the windows was shattered, glass still clinging to the frame. The sight of it made me uneasy right away. Something about the way it leaned, silent and heavy in the clearing, gave me the feeling that I was intruding. But my curiosity pulled me closer. I went up the steps carefully, the wood groaning under my weight, and pushed on the door. It gave after a hard shove, swinging inward with a low screech of rusty hinges. The air that came out was thick, stale, and sour, like wet wood mixed with mold. Inside, the cabin was dim even though it was still daylight. The boards over the windows let in only narrow strips of sun. Dust floated in the beams. The floor was warped, and in one corner I saw where water must have leaked in for years, leaving dark stains and soft spots. A broken chair lay on its side, one leg splintered clean off. There was an iron bed frame against the far wall, the mattress rotted down to coils and rags. An old stove sat in the corner, its surface caked in rust. On the wall hung a crooked shelf with a few jars, their contents dark and unrecognizable. I felt an odd chill even though the air outside had been warm. My instinct told me I shouldn't be inside, but instead of leaving, I kept walking deeper into the one-room space. My boots stirred dust with each step. I noticed claw marks on the doorframe leading to what looked like a tiny pantry. Long, deep gouges that didn't seem like they were from tools, more like animals. The pantry was worse. The shelves sagged, some broken, and the smell in there was sharper, almost metallic. The floor was scattered with old cans, their labels peeled off. I saw a pile of bones in the corner, small ones, maybe raccoon or squirrel, but there were enough of them to make me uneasy. I backed out quickly and went to the main room again. My heart was beating harder, though nothing had happened yet. Still, the place felt wrong. It wasn't just abandonment. It felt like someone had lived there far longer than they should have. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. Near the bed frame, half hidden under the mattress remains, there was a small metal box. I crouched and pulled it out. The latch was broken, and inside I found scraps of paper, damp and curling. Most were unreadable, but a few words stood out. Dates from the late 1960s, mentions of work out back, noise in the trees, don't stay out after dark. The handwriting was jagged, rushed. My stomach tightened as I put the papers back. By now I was ready to leave, but when I stepped toward the door, I heard it. A noise outside, not close but not far either. Something moving through the brush. I froze, listening. It wasn't the wind. The sound was heavy, steady, like footsteps, then a pause, then more. I crouched low, peering through the broken window, but saw nothing except trees shifting in the late sun. The sound grew closer, slow but deliberate. My chest thumped hard. I thought about calling out but stopped myself. Whoever or whatever it was, I didn't want them to know I was in there. I stayed still, barely breathing, waiting. After a long minute, the noise faded, like whoever it was had circled and gone deeper into the woods. My hands shook as I stood again. I didn't want to stay the night anymore. I didn't even want to stay another hour. I grabbed my bag and stepped quickly out of the cabin, the boards groaning under me again. The clearing felt too open, like eyes could be on me from anywhere in the trees. I pushed through the brush back toward where I thought the deer path was, moving faster now. The woods seemed louder. The buzz of insects, the crack of sticks under my own boots, the rush of my breath. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone following. It took me nearly an hour to find my way back to the old logging road. By then the sun was dropping, the light dim and gold through the trees. I walked quickly, refusing to stop until I reached my truck. When I finally saw it parked in the tall grass, I felt my whole body loosen. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there a while before starting the engine. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't shake the image of the cabin. The broken bed frame, the scraps of paper, the sound of footsteps outside. I thought about what kind of person had lived there, writing about noises in the trees, hiding their notes in a box under a mattress. I wondered if they had stayed there too long, cut off from the world, slowly losing their mind. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not then and not for years. It felt too strange, too personal. But I never went hiking in that part of the woods again. Every time I think of it, I can still smell the rot of that cabin and feel the weight of the silence pressing down. And the thing that has stayed with me most, the detail I can never shake, is that when I left, I never saw anyone. No person, no animal, just the sound of footsteps in the brush, circling me, as if whoever had been out there knew I had stepped inside that cabin, and wanted me to know they knew. I was 36 the year I decided to rent a cabin in Northumberland for a week in late October. The timing wasn't the smartest choice, I'll admit that now. The days were already short, and the nights seemed endless. I had booked the cabin months earlier thinking it would be the perfect quiet escape, away from work and the constant noise of the city. The listing described it as a simple woodland lodge with basic amenities. No internet, no television, just a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bed. That was all I thought I needed. I arrived late in the afternoon after a long drive up from London. The roads grew narrower the further north I went, twisting between fields and hedgerows until I finally reached the edge of the forest. The cabin sat on a rough gravel track, about a mile in from the main road, surrounded by tall trees that pressed in from every side. It was smaller than I expected, just a square wooden structure with a pitched roof and a single window facing the path. The walls were weathered, and the wood looked almost gray from years of rain. The place looked deserted, though the man who rented it out to me swore it had been cleaned the week before. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp, but everything was neat. There was a rug near the fireplace, a small wooden table, and a bed with a heavy wool blanket. The silence was the first thing that struck me. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, like the trees outside swallowed any sound before it could travel far. Even my footsteps on the wooden floor felt muted. That first evening, I unpacked, lit a fire, and made myself some tea. I sat by the window, looking out at the fading light between the trees. The forest turned darker and darker until it was just blackness pressing against the glass. I couldn't see anything beyond my own reflection, and it made me uneasy. I turned away from the window and tried to read a book I had brought with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the trees. It was just nerves, I told myself. The mind plays tricks when you're in a new place. But still, I locked the door before going to bed and checked it twice. The first night passed without issue, though I barely slept. I woke several times, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. At around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard footsteps outside, crunching softly on the gravel path. I froze, listening, but the sound faded before I could be sure. When morning came, I tried to convince myself it had been the wind carrying stray noises through the woods. On the second evening, I decided to walk a bit along the gravel track before it got fully dark. The forest was dense, the branches overhead knitting together in places so that only strips of sky showed through. The air was cold, and my breath clouded as I walked. About half a mile from the cabin, I noticed something strange. On the edge of the track, where the grass met the trees, there was a patch of flattened ground, as though someone had been standing there repeatedly. The grass was pressed down into a rough oval shape. Could have been animals, I told myself, though I couldn't think of any that would leave a mark like that. I walked back quickly, suddenly anxious for the safety of the cabin walls. That night, I couldn't relax. I lit the fire early, kept the lights on, and tried to distract myself. But as I sat by the window again, I thought I saw something pale between the trees. A shape, a figure. It wasn't clear, and the flames inside reflected on the glass, making it hard to tell. I leaned closer, trying to focus. For a second, I was certain I saw the outline of a person standing just beyond the first line of trees. A woman, I thought, though I couldn't say why. She didn't move. She didn't come closer. She was just there, watching. My chest tightened. I blinked, and when my eyes adjusted, the shape was gone. I shut the curtains after that. The following morning, I checked the area outside. There were faint marks in the soil near the trees, as though someone had been standing there. Not deep footprints, but patches where the leaves were disturbed, scattered more than the rest. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to believe it could have been deer or some other animal. By the fourth night, I was barely sleeping. Every time the cabin creaked, every time the wind shifted, I jolted awake. Around midnight, I got up to stoke the fire, and for some reason, I pulled the curtain back an inch to look outside. My stomach dropped instantly. There was someone standing in the clearing, just at the edge of the gravel track. A woman. She wore a long coat that looked heavy, the kind of thing that might have been worn decades ago. Her hair was dark and tangled, hanging around her shoulders. Even from the distance, I could see how pale her face was. She wasn't moving. She was staring directly at the cabin, directly at me. I froze, my hands still holding the curtain. She didn't come closer. She didn't turn away. She just stood there, locked in place, her face catching the dim light from the window. I don't know how long I stood like that, staring back. Finally, I dropped the curtain and backed away. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair near the fireplace with a kitchen knife on my lap, waiting for morning. When daylight finally came, I rushed outside. The clearing was empty, but there were footprints this time. Small, narrow ones leading from the trees to the spot where I'd seen her. The footprints turned back into the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth. That was the breaking point. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things quickly, stuffing them into the car without care. I didn't even bother cleaning up. As I loaded the last bag, I glanced back at the cabin one final time. The curtains I had drawn were slightly open again, though I knew I hadn't touched them since pulling them shut. The drive back down the gravel track was tense, every bump in the road making me glance at the mirror. I half expected to see her standing behind the car, watching me go. But the road stayed empty. The trees closed in, then opened again as I reached the main road. I didn't look back again. In the weeks after, I tried to explain it away. Maybe she was some local woman wandering the woods. Maybe she was lost or curious or not right in the head. But none of those answers gave me peace. What haunted me most was how still she had been. Not restless, not wandering, just fixed on the cabin as though she had been waiting. Even now, months later, I still wake at night with the image of her pale face caught in the dark. And I know, without any doubt, that if I had stayed even one more night in that cabin, she would not have just watched from the trees. I had been working long shifts in construction for most of that year, and by late autumn of 1998, I felt completely burned out. A friend of mine had an old hunting cabin in northern Arizona, out near the edge of the Navajo Nation. He wasn't using it that season, so he handed me the keys and told me I could stay out there for as long as I wanted. I wasn't really a hunter, but I figured the change of pace, the quiet, and the clean air would help me reset. The cabin sat about 10 miles from the nearest paved road. To get there, you had to take a dirt track that twisted through scrubby desert and patches of pine before climbing into a rocky slope. My old Chevy rattled hard over the ruts, but it got me there. The place was nothing fancy. A single-room cabin with a small wood stove, 2 narrow windows, and a rickety porch. Behind it, the land sloped down into brush and juniper, and further off you could see the flat, open desert stretching for miles. I arrived just before dusk, unloaded my cooler, a duffel bag, and a few supplies, then set some logs by the stove. The first night passed quietly. The wind carried the smell of pine and dirt, and when the stars came out, they were so bright it felt like they were pressing down against the earth. It was the kind of silence you don't hear in town anymore. The next morning, I took a walk along a dry wash a little ways from the cabin. There were prints in the sand, coyote, maybe a bobcat. I didn't think much of it. This was wild country. When I got back to the cabin, though, I noticed something strange. Around the fire pit outside, the dirt looked disturbed, like someone had walked around it barefoot. The prints weren't clear, but they didn't look like coyote. They were too long, too narrow, with toes spread wide apart. I brushed it off. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe just odd erosion from the wind overnight. I cooked up some eggs and spent most of the day reading and chopping wood. That night, the air turned cold. I sat by the stove, dozing on and off, when I heard a noise outside. At first I thought it was the wind again, but then I caught a sharp, quick sound, like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. The boards creaked one by one. I sat up straight, heart pounding, staring at the door. Nothing happened for a while. Then the steps seemed to circle the cabin, gravel crunching under weight. I thought about calling out, but I held still. Eventually it went quiet. I told myself it must have been an animal nosing around, maybe a stray dog, but my gut didn't buy it. In the morning, I checked outside. The dirt around the porch showed tracks again, only clearer this time. Bare feet, long, thin toes pressed deep into the ground, as if whoever it was had been standing there for a while, watching. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to stay rational. Maybe some drifter had wandered onto the land. Maybe someone from the reservation nearby. That night, I kept the lantern on. Around midnight, I woke up to another sound. It wasn't footsteps this time, but something stranger. It was breathing, heavy, uneven, right outside the wall near my head. I could hear it clear, as if someone was leaning against the cabin, exhaling slow. My throat felt dry as sand. I gripped the hatchet I kept near the stove and waited. After a long stretch, it stopped. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat awake till dawn, staring at the door. When I finally stepped outside, the prints were there again, circling the cabin in uneven loops. Some of them looked wrong. The toes seemed longer, more splayed, almost claw-like. I decided to pack up and leave, but curiosity gnawed at me. I told myself I'd give it one more night. Maybe I'd catch whoever was doing it, prove to myself it wasn't what my mind was making it out to be. That evening, I stacked more logs on the stove and left the lantern dark, hoping to see better outside. The moon was high, washing the desert in silver light. Hours passed with nothing but the crackle of wood. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, like nails dragging along the porch post. My heart hammered. I moved slowly to the window and peeked out. First, I saw nothing. Then, movement near the edge of the clearing. A figure crouched low, pale against the dirt, its limbs too long for its body. It moved in short, jerky bursts, stopping every few steps, head twisting as though it was sniffing the air. It wasn't walking like a normal person. It looked more like an animal forcing itself upright. I froze, barely breathing, afraid the glass would give me away. The figure crept closer, and I could make out more detail. Bare skin stretched over bone, shoulders hunched unnaturally high, arms dangling too long. The head tilted at an odd angle, and for a second I thought it was wearing something like the hide of a coyote draped over its skull. The thing circled the cabin, brushing the walls, scraping with its fingers, paused at the door. I could see the shadow of its hand reaching for the handle, fingers trembling. I tightened my grip on the hatchet, ready for the worst. But after a long silence, it moved away, slipping into the brush. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I walked the property fast, scanning for any sign. The ground was torn up with prints again, dozens of them, crisscrossing in wild directions. Some were human-like, others bent and twisted, as if halfway between a man's foot and an animal's paw. That was enough for me. I stuffed my bag, threw everything in the truck, and drove hard down that dirt track without looking back. I didn't even stop to check the rearview mirror. Later that day, I pulled into a gas station near Flagstaff. A local guy saw the cabin keychain still hanging from my ignition and told me quick that people had been whispering about strange sightings out in those hills for years. He said folks around there avoided that patch of land at night, that they believed things moved through there that weren't meant to be seen. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him what I had seen. I never went back to that cabin. I handed the key back to my friend and told him flat I wouldn't stay there again. I still don't know what I witnessed. I don't want to. All I know is that something was out there, and it wasn't just a man, and it wasn't just an animal. It was both or neither, and it watched me for 3 nights straight. Even now, years later, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear that slow breathing outside the wall, like it's waiting for me to open the door. I was 37 the year I decided to rent a small hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was the summer of 2009, and I wanted time away from my normal routine. The cabin had been listed online by some local man, and the price was cheap compared to other rentals. He described it as rustic, quiet, perfect for someone looking for solitude. That was exactly what I thought I needed. I had been working in construction for years, my back always sore, my head always heavy, and I believed being alone for a while might straighten me out. The drive out to the place took nearly 3 hours from the nearest town. The farther I went, the narrower the roads became. First paved, then gravel, then just dirt tracks winding between thick pine and birch. The trees seemed to press in on all sides, and I lost radio signal before I even reached the halfway mark. I didn't think much of it at the time. I liked the idea of being cut off, no phone calls, no noise but the wind and birds. The cabin sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by tall grass that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. The building itself was old, built of weathered logs with a metal roof spotted with rust. The door sagged a little on its hinges, and one of the shutters on the front window hung crooked, barely attached. It wasn't much, but I didn't care. Inside it smelled faintly of damp wood and mouse droppings, but there was a cot, a wood stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and a shelf with a few dusty pots and pans. I unloaded my cooler, my duffel bag, and a folding chair, then shut the door behind me. The first couple of days were simple. I spent the mornings walking the trails nearby, sometimes following deer tracks until I lost them in the underbrush. The afternoons I sat outside with a book or tried to fish at the nearby creek. At night, I cooked small meals over the stove and listened to the crackle of the fire. The quiet was heavy, almost like a weight pressing on me, but it felt good. On the 3rd night, something felt off. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was just the sense that the woods were not as empty as they had been before. I was sitting on the small porch around dusk, watching the sun sink through the trees, when I noticed a movement across the clearing. Not an animal darting by, not a deer, but something standing still. I squinted, but the light was low and the trees cast deep shadows. By the time I tried to focus, there was nothing there. I brushed it off. Eyes play tricks when the light fades. That night, I woke to a faint sound outside. It was past midnight. I lay on the cot, holding my breath, listening. The noise was soft, like something brushing against the outer wall. A slow, dragging sound, then silence. I waited, every muscle tense, the blankets pulled up to my chest. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was a branch moved by the wind. I turned on my side and eventually drifted back to sleep, though not deeply. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The grass was bent down in a few spots near the wall, but I couldn't see anything clear. No boot prints, no paw marks, nothing. I told myself it was just the damp soil making the ground uneven. That evening, I tried to shake off the unease by walking further down the dirt road. It wound on, no other cabins, no houses, no fences, nothing. After about an hour, I turned back, and by the time I reached the clearing again, the sun was almost gone. The cabin looked darker, smaller, more isolated than ever. I locked the door that night. It was just a simple bolt, but it gave me a small sense of control. I cooked, ate, and climbed into bed early. Around 2 in the morning, I woke again, this time to a different sound. Not dragging, but footsteps. Slow, steady, moving just beyond the wall. My heart hammered. I held my breath and listened as the steps circled the cabin. They weren't heavy like boots, but not light like deer. It was careful, measured. I sat up in bed, staring at the dark outline of the door. The steps stopped near the porch. I waited, staring, ears straining. Then I heard the faint creak of the wooden step outside. My throat went dry. Someone was standing there. I gripped the handle of the small hatchet I had brought, my palms sweating. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, and finally the noise stopped. I didn't hear anyone walk away. When daylight came, I opened the door. The grass on the porch was pressed down, as though someone had been standing there for a while. I scanned the clearing, but there was no one. I told myself maybe a coyote or a bear had wandered close, but that didn't explain the slow, deliberate steps. By the 5th night, my nerves were thin. I barely slept. Every snap of a branch outside made me sit up. My body ached from the tension. I considered leaving, but the thought of driving that long dirt road alone at night kept me in place. On the 6th night, it got worse. I was lying awake, staring at the dark ceiling, when I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, slower, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. They stopped at the window. The broken shutter rattled slightly, and I could feel the presence on the other side of the thin glass. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then came the sound of fingernails or something scraping against the wood of the window frame. A steady, testing scrape. I sat in silence until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. The wood below the window had fresh marks, shallow grooves cut into it. Not from claws, not from animals, these were deliberate, human. That was when I decided to leave. I packed my bag quickly, barely bothering to fold anything. The clearing felt wrong now, the air heavy, the trees too close. I loaded the cooler into the car and kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone step out from the tree line. The drive back down the dirt road felt endless. Every shadow between the trunks seemed to hold movement. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard they ached. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't stop until I reached a diner on the edge of town. Inside, surrounded by noise and people, I felt my chest finally loosen. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I looked it up again, and the listing was gone. Maybe the owner pulled it, maybe something else happened. I never found out. All I knew was that someone had been watching me out there, circling the cabin at night, testing the windows, waiting. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't care. I was lucky to leave before they made their move. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the night and hear faint footsteps in my memory. Slow, steady, circling, waiting. I was 36 the summer I decided to spend a few weeks alone on my uncle's farm cabin in southern Iowa. It was the summer of 2012, and I remember the heat being thick and heavy in the air every day. The cabin sat on a piece of land my uncle rarely used anymore, surrounded by cornfields that stretched so far you could stand on the porch and feel swallowed by them. The place was plain and worn down, built with wide wood planks that had turned gray over time. It had one bedroom, a small living area with an old couch, and a back door that opened to a patch of overgrown weeds leading out to a rusted barn. I told myself I wanted quiet. My life in Des Moines was loud, full of people, traffic, and constant noise. At first, the stillness was good. I spent mornings on the porch with coffee, listening to nothing but insects and the occasional faraway tractor. At night, I cooked simple meals and read by the dim yellow lamp in the corner. The cabin smelled of old wood and dry dust, and when the wind blew through the cracked windows, it carried in the smell of cut grass from the fields. But the longer I stayed, the more I began to notice things that made me uneasy. It started with sounds. At night, lying in bed, I would hear shuffling noises outside the cabin. It wasn't the light scratching of small animals. It was heavier, slower. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps pressing down on dry dirt. I told myself it was deer moving through the fields, maybe raccoons nosing near the porch. The corn was tall that year, thick enough to hide anything. Still, I lay awake listening, waiting for it to pass. One evening around dusk, I was out by the barn. The sun had gone down far enough that the fields looked like dark waves. I caught sight of movement at the edge of the corn. Someone, at least I thought it was someone, ducked back into the stalks just as I turned. I froze, staring at the empty space. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I told myself it must have been a shadow, or maybe I'd imagined it. But I couldn't shake the sharp feeling that I had been watched. The barn itself made me uneasy too. Inside, it smelled of oil and old hay. Rusted tools leaned against the walls, and the floor was littered with dry straw that crunched under my boots. I avoided spending time in there. Sometimes I caught the faint smell of smoke, like a match had been struck and blown out, though I could never find a source. After a week, I started locking the doors and windows even during the day. The cabin's locks were flimsy, just old brass knobs that didn't feel like they'd hold up against a good shove. The nights grew longer. I began leaving the lamp on when I went to bed, its dim glow spreading across the floor. Sleep came in broken pieces, with me waking up to small creaks and thuds. The worst moment came one night when I was in bed, staring at the ceiling. I heard the porch boards creak. One step, then another. slow and deliberate, like weight pressing carefully down. My stomach nodded. I didn't move. My breath felt too loud in the small room. The steps stopped near the front door. I lay frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, nothing else happened, and I must have drifted off from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, when I opened the front door, the dirt outside had fresh prints. Not animal tracks, shoes. Bare footprints too, pressed into the soft ground near the edge of the porch. They were smeared like someone had dragged their heel as they walked away. I stood there staring at them for a long time, my skin prickling with cold sweat. I wanted to believe it was teenagers messing around, but the farm was miles away from the nearest house. No one would walk that far just to creep around. The days blurred after that. I stopped going near the barn. I barely stepped off the porch. I kept the windows shut, even though it made the cabin unbearably hot. Every sound outside felt amplified. A snapping branch would make my chest tighten. The wind moving the corn stalks sounded too much like whispers. One afternoon, I decided to walk down the dirt road that led away from the cabin, just to clear my head. The heat shimmered off the road, and sweat rolled down my back within minutes. About a mile out, I spotted something lying in the ditch. An old flannel shirt, ripped at the sleeves, covered in dirt. It looked like it had been there a while, but something about it bothered me. The way it was laid out flat, like someone had placed it there instead of dropping it. I didn't touch it. I turned around and walked back faster than I'd come. By the second week, I was running on edge. I barely slept, barely ate. My body felt weak from the stress. On the 12th night, I woke up again to the sound of the porch creaking. My chest pounded as I stared at the door, the lamp still glowing faintly. The doorknob rattled. Not hard, just enough to make it jiggle against the lock. I held my breath, gripping the side of the mattress. After a long minute, it stopped. The next morning, I checked the door. The knob had faint scratches around it, like someone had tried to work at it with something sharp. I packed my things that afternoon. I didn't care about finishing my planned weeks there. I drove back to Des Moines with the windows down, the air blasting in my face, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. I never told my uncle the details. I just said the place made me uneasy. He sold the farm cabin 2 years later to a couple from out of state. I've never gone back. Looking back, I know what I heard and saw was real. It wasn't ghosts or anything from stories, it was a person. Someone had been moving around that farm at night, watching me, maybe waiting for me to slip up. I still think about the footprints, the shirt in the ditch, the scratches on the lock. Someone had been out there, hidden by those endless cornfields. And if I'd stayed longer, I'm not sure I would have left at all. I still remember the summer I took a seasonal job as a park ranger in northern Montana back in 1998. I was 26, restless, and looking for a way to clear my head after a string of poor decisions in my personal life. The idea of spending a few months away from crowded streets and noisy bars sounded perfect. The ranger station where I worked wasn't too far from the main entrance of the park, but part of the job meant spending nights out at a small cabin deeper in the forest, about an hour's drive from the nearest paved road. The cabin was old, built decades earlier, and used by rangers who had to patrol the backcountry. When I first got there, the isolation didn't bother me. In fact, it was kind of peaceful. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick lodgepole pines and spruce, with a narrow dirt trail leading down to a creek. The place had the basics: a wood stove, a bunk bed, a small desk, and shelves stocked with canned food and first aid supplies. There was no electricity, no phone line, and of course no cell service back then in that part of the mountains. We carried radios, but the signal was unreliable once you got too far into the trees. I thought I could handle it just fine. My days were spent checking trails, clearing fallen branches, and making notes on wildlife activity. I often hiked alone, carrying a map, compass, and the heavy radio strapped to my belt. At night, I'd return to the cabin, cook something simple on the stove, and read by lantern light until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. For a while, it was everything I wanted. Quiet, simple, and far away from my messy life back in town. But as the weeks passed, small things started to make me uneasy. It began with noises at night. At first, I told myself it was just animals. A cabin in the woods will always attract curious creatures. Bears rummaging near the fire pit, raccoons scratching at the siding, owls calling in the distance. I was used to those sounds. What I wasn't used to were the footsteps. One night, I was lying in bed, staring up at the dark rafters, when I heard what sounded like deliberate, steady steps in the clearing outside. They crunched softly against the pine needles and then stopped, as if whoever or whatever it was had frozen in place. I held my breath, waiting, listening so hard that my ears began to ring. A full minute passed, then two, before the sound faded into the woods. The next morning, I walked around the cabin and found nothing but my own boot prints and the usual scatter of animal tracks. I convinced myself it must have been an elk or a deer wandering close. A few nights later, I heard it again. This time, the steps circled the cabin slowly, pausing every so often. The wood of the porch creaked under weight that seemed too heavy for a deer. I gripped the handle of the axe I kept near the door and stayed awake until the sky turned pale. When I finally stepped outside, there were faint impressions in the dirt near the clearing. They weren't clean footprints, but the ground was disturbed in a way that suggested someone had been walking there. I tried to shake it off and focus on my work, but the unease kept building. During my patrols, I started noticing strange things. A broken tree branch that looked freshly snapped, but with no storm to blame it on. A pile of stones stacked neatly beside the trail, in a place where I knew I hadn't seen them before. Once, near the creek, I found the remnants of a campfire, still blackened with ash. That wasn't unusual by itself. Plenty of hikers ignored the no-fire rule, but something about the way the logs were arranged felt odd, almost like the fire had been left burning long after it should have been put out. The thing that bothered me most was the feeling of being watched. It's hard to explain, but when you spend enough time in the wilderness, you learn to notice when something is off. The forest usually has a rhythm. The birds, the wind, the buzzing of insects. But sometimes, as I hiked, everything would fall silent. No birdsong, no movement in the trees, just a stillness that pressed down on me until I could hear my own heartbeat. That's when I'd catch myself turning around, scanning the tree line, certain that someone was just out of sight. One afternoon, I was assigned to check an old trail about 4 miles from the cabin. It hadn't been maintained in years, and I had to fight through thick undergrowth to follow it. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. Halfway down, I found a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was faded blue, like denim, and frayed around the edges. I stuffed it in my pocket, figuring it might belong to a lost hiker. But when I reported it back at the main station a few days later, nobody had logged a missing person in that area. The weeks dragged on, and the footsteps at night became a regular thing. Sometimes they came close, right up to the walls of the cabin. Once, I thought I heard the faint rattle of the door handle. I started barricading the door with a chair every night and keeping the axe beside my bed. I hardly slept, dozing lightly until every crack and groan of the cabin jolted me awake. My nerves were shot, and I began dreading my nights out there. The breaking point came one evening in late July. I was returning from a long patrol when I noticed something wrong. The cabin door was slightly open. I froze at the edge of the clearing, every hair on my neck standing on end. I knew I had locked it that morning. I checked it twice before leaving. My first thought was a bear had forced its way in, but when I looked closer, the doorframe wasn't damaged. I stepped inside slowly, my axe in hand. The air was heavy, musty, but nothing seemed out of place at first glance. Then I saw it. The lantern I always kept on the shelf had been moved to the floor, set neatly beside the bunk. My spare boots were turned sideways, not where I had left them. Whoever had been inside hadn't taken anything, but they had touched my things, moved them, as if to let me know they'd been there. I backed out of the cabin, heart pounding so hard it made me dizzy. I didn't bother staying the night. I grabbed my pack and hiked the 1.5 miles down to the service road, where I waited until another ranger drove by in the morning. I told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to switch shifts. I didn't mention the door, the footsteps, or the moved items. I never spent another night at that cabin. A few weeks later, my seasonal job ended, and I left Montana altogether. It's been years since then, but I still think about it. The cabin is probably still standing out there, tucked in the trees, quiet and empty. I know people might dismiss what I experienced as nerves, or maybe even a drifter passing through the forest. But I can't forget the sound of those footsteps circling me at night, or the sight of my things shifted just enough to prove I wasn't alone. Sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I still hear those steps in my head, steady and deliberate, and I wonder who or what kind of person was out there in the dark woods, watching me from just beyond the tree line. The rain had started just before evening, a soft drizzle at first, then it grew heavier as night fell. I had been working since early morning, dragging logs, cutting them down to the right length, stripping bark, stacking them, then going back into the woods for more. My arms ached from lifting and hammering, my back was sore from bending, and every part of me was damp with sweat, dirt, and now rain. I was 34, and this was my first attempt at building something bigger than a shed. I had picked this patch of ground on the far edge of a clearing in northern Arkansas, about 40 miles from the nearest town, because I wanted a place where no one could bother me. The land wasn't mine, not legally anyway, but it was far enough from any road or trail that I doubted anyone would ever come looking. I had brought a tarp, a handsaw, an axe, nails, and a hammer. The rest had to come from the forest itself. By the time the rain picked up, I had managed to get 4 walls half done, logs stacked and notched, the corners beginning to lock together. No roof yet. The ground was already soft, mud sticking to my boots every time I stepped, making me feel heavier. The sound of the rain on the leaves was constant, like static in my ears. I didn't plan on staying the night at first, but the weather turned too quickly. The path back down the ridge would have been slick, and carrying all my tools in the dark was asking for a twisted ankle or worse. I decided I'd wait it out, keep working under the tarp I had tied between 2 pines. My lantern sat on an overturned bucket, giving me a pale circle of light that shivered in the rain. The forest at night feels different, and with the rain it felt even smaller, like the trees leaned closer. I could hear water dripping everywhere, some drops heavy enough to sound like footsteps. The air smelled of wet earth, wood, and the faint metallic tang of the nails I kept in a tin. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. I had eaten earlier a couple of sandwiches, nothing warm. Now I wished I had packed a stove. I kept hammering. Each strike echoed dull in the wet air. My gloves were soaked, my fingers numb, the nails slippery when I tried to set them. The tarp above sagged under the weight of the water pooling in its folds, and I had to push up on it every half hour to spill the water off before it ripped loose. Each time I did, cold rain poured down my arms, soaking me deeper. The lantern hissed softly, and the shadows stretched across the half-finished walls. I tried to focus on the work, but the night kept pressing in. Every sound carried, branches cracking, leaves shifting. Once I froze, holding the hammer midair, because I thought I heard something heavier than rain moving beyond the treeline. I waited, staring into the dark, but nothing moved after that. I told myself it was just a branch falling. Still, my chest stayed tight. By midnight, I had given up on real progress. My arms could barely lift the hammer anymore, and the mud sucked at my boots when I tried to move. I pulled my sleeping bag out from my pack and spread it inside the walls of the cabin, the only spot that felt even a little sheltered. There was no roof, but the walls broke some of the wind, and I kept the lantern close. The rain drummed on, steady and heavy. I lay there with my clothes still damp, the bag soaking underneath me where the ground leaked water up through it. The smell of wet wood was sharp. I tried to close my eyes, but the noises wouldn't let me. Every few minutes there was a new sound. A branch snapping, a splash in the mud, a rustle that seemed too close. My body wouldn't relax. At one point I heard footsteps, not the random scatter of an animal, but slow, heavy steps in the mud, coming from behind the wall. I held my breath, my hand gripping the hammer tight. The steps stopped just outside the corner. I stared at the dark, willing my eyes to catch some shape, but all I saw was the reflection of the lantern on wet wood. I waited like that for what felt like hours, the rain masking everything else. Finally, I convinced myself I had imagined it, just my head playing tricks with the rhythm of the rain. I must have dozed off sometime near dawn, because when I opened my eyes, the lantern had burned low, just a weak glow left. The rain hadn't stopped, but it had eased into a thin mist, the kind that hangs in the air instead of falling. My body was stiff, my clothes still wet, but I was alive, and nothing had disturbed me while I slept. When I crawled out of the bag, I saw them, prints in the mud. Not animal, not deer, not bear. Boots. They circled the cabin walls, pressed deep into the wet earth, each one filling slowly with water from the rain. Whoever had been there had walked around the whole thing while I slept, close enough to reach through the gaps in the logs if they had wanted to. My chest felt hollow, my stomach twisted. I looked into the trees, half expecting to see someone still watching. But the forest was still, the mist drifting low across the ground. Whoever it was had left before morning. I packed everything fast. The nails went back into the tin, the hammer and saw shoved into my bag, the tarp ripped down from the trees. My boots slid in the mud as I hurried, my eyes never leaving the treeline. I didn't care about finishing the cabin anymore. I didn't care about the hours of work I had already put in. I just wanted out. The trail back was slick, the mud threatening to pull me down the slope with each step, but I kept going. My shoulders ached under the weight of the pack, my breath short and sharp in the damp air. The whole way down I felt exposed, like whoever had been there might step out at any moment. By the time I reached my truck at the bottom of the ridge, the rain had finally stopped. The world looked washed clean, the dirt road shining wet in the morning light. I loaded my gear into the bed, slammed the tailgate, and climbed inside. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I didn't look back at the ridge. I didn't want to see the treeline, didn't want to think about the half-finished cabin sitting empty up there. Someone had been watching me work, waiting until nightfall to get close. I had no idea if they'd come back, if they had been curious, or if they had planned something worse but changed their mind. All I knew was that I wasn't going back. That patch of forest could keep the logs, the nails, and the walls I built. I didn't need a cabin that badly. The thought of lying there again, half asleep while someone circled me in the rain, was enough to turn my stomach. I drove until the ridge was miles behind me, until the forest thinned into open land and the rain was just a memory on the windshield. The cabin was gone from my plans, gone from my life. Some places, I realized, are better left unfinished. I was 35 years old the summer I drove up north to my grandmother's old cabin. It was late August, and the heat in the city had been unbearable. The kind that sat heavy on your chest and made the nights feel like you were lying under a wet towel. The cabin was in a quiet part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, near the woods where the pine trees grew so thick that light barely touched the ground. I hadn't been there in years, not since my grandmother passed away 6 months before. She had lived there full-time for over 2 decades, alone after my grandfather died. The family hadn't dealt with the property yet. My mother kept saying she'd go, but she always made excuses. My uncles didn't want anything to do with it either. I volunteered because I felt someone needed to check on it, clean out what could be cleaned, and figure out what was still inside. I also wanted to see it one last time. I had memories of summers spent there as a kid, fishing in the cold lakes, running around barefoot in the damp grass, and watching my grandmother cook simple meals on the old wood stove. I arrived in the early evening. The drive itself took most of the day. By the time I pulled off the main road and onto the narrow dirt trail, the air had already cooled down. The cabin sat at the end of that trail, half hidden by trees, its roofline just peeking above the brush. It looked smaller than I remembered, the wood darker, weathered by years of snow and rain. The grass around it had grown tall, almost waist-high in some spots, and I had to park the car a little ways off and walk the rest of the path. The front porch creaked when I stepped onto it. The boards were soft under my boots, and I could feel where they had started to rot. The windows were dusty, the curtains drawn inside. The place gave off a smell the moment I pushed the door open. A stale, heavy odor, like damp clothes mixed with something sour. I assumed it was just from being shut tight for half a year. Inside, nothing looked touched. My grandmother's coat still hung on the rack by the door. There were boots lined up neatly, the same way she always kept them. The old couch was draped with a quilt, and the bookshelf was full of her worn-out paperbacks. I noticed a mug on the table, dried tea leaves stuck to the bottom, as if she had set it down one morning and never picked it back up. I moved slowly, checking each room, opening windows to let in air. Dust floated in the light, drifting like tiny particles of ash. The air still smelled wrong, heavier than just dust and old wood. I told myself it was probably mice or maybe some spoiled food left behind in the pantry. When I reached the back bedroom, I hesitated. This had been her room, the place I had only ever stepped into a few times. She was private about it, and as a child, I was told not to go in without permission. The door was shut, and when I pressed the knob, it resisted. I pushed harder, and it gave way with a squeak. The air that spilled out made my stomach tighten. It was a sickly sweet smell, mixed with something metallic, something that clung to the back of my throat. The curtains in the room were closed, but I could still make out the bed. At first, I thought it was just piles of clothes, blankets stacked up in a strange shape. But the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't that. My grandmother was there, lying on her side, half covered by a quilt. For a moment, my mind didn't want to process it. I thought about how she had been buried in the spring, how I had stood at her funeral and watched the coffin go down into the earth. But this wasn't a dream. The body on the bed was hers. The skin was darkened, the features sunken, and parts of her face seemed melted into the pillow. I froze in the doorway. The smell pushed me back, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. My brain scrambled to make sense of it. Maybe they had taken her body to the hospital and returned it. Maybe this wasn't real, but I knew, deep down, there was only one explanation. She had died in this room. She had passed away in that bed, and no one had found her for weeks, maybe even months, before the funeral was arranged. The coffin we had buried hadn't held her. Maybe it was closed for a reason. Maybe someone hadn't said the full truth. The thought sent a cold wave down my back. I stepped closer, covering my mouth with my sleeve. The air was suffocating. I saw details I didn't want to see. Her thin fingers curled stiff against the sheets, her hair matted, The quilt fused to parts of her body. There were dark stains on the mattress that had spread outward in uneven patches. I could hear flies buzzing faintly in the corners of the room, though I didn't see them at first. I backed out quickly, slamming the door shut harder than I meant to. My chest was tight, and I leaned against the wall trying to breathe. I felt dizzy, like the whole place had tilted. I had to get out of the cabin. I grabbed my bag, pushed open the front door, and stumbled outside into the cooler air. I sat on the steps for a long time, staring at the trees. My mind kept going in circles, trying to figure out what to do. It wasn't just that she had died there. It was that nobody had told me. Nobody had said she had been left in that bed for so long. When I finally calmed enough to move, I got back in the car and drove until I reached the nearest gas station, almost 20 miles down the road. I called the local sheriff's office from the payphone outside. My voice shook as I explained what I had found. 2 hours later, I was back at the cabin with them. They walked inside with masks and gloves, their flashlights sweeping through the rooms. I stayed on the porch, refusing to go back in. The officers came out eventually, their faces serious. They didn't say much, only that the body was indeed my grandmother's and that the situation was complicated. It turned out the funeral we had attended had been handled by a relative who had insisted on a closed casket, saying it was better that way. None of us questioned it. No one thought to ask why the coffin seemed heavier than expected or why the burial arrangements had been rushed. The truth was simple and ugly. My grandmother had been left there all along, her body too far gone by the time anyone came. The cabin was sealed off after that. Weeks later, the family sold it to strangers, who tore most of it down and rebuilt. I never went back, but the image never left me. Even now, years later, I still see her when I close my eyes, the way she lay under that quilt, frozen in the place where she had spent the last years of her life, abandoned in the silence of those woods. And sometimes I wonder if, deep down, part of me had known all along why the house smelled that way, why the air felt heavier than it should. It wasn't the cabin that haunted me. It was the fact that she had been there, waiting long after the rest of us had moved on. I drove out of the small town later than I planned, the sky already dim with the weight of evening. The cabin I was heading to wasn't mine. It belonged to a family friend who had left it unused for years, and I had asked if I could stay there for a couple nights to get away from everything. It was in northern Minnesota, tucked between long stretches of forest and a half-dry creek bed that still trickled faintly if you stood close enough to listen. I had my dog with me, a medium-sized mixed breed named Rusty, who sat in the passenger seat with his head resting on the armrest, his eyes half closed from the drive. It was the middle of October, 2012. The air was cold enough to make me keep the heat on in the truck. Rusty had his nose pressed against the cracked window, catching every scent. The dirt road narrowed until branches scraped the sides of the vehicle, and when I finally parked, the cabin sat there like it had been dropped out of another decade. One story, plain wood siding, an old tin chimney, and a small porch with a broken railing. The grass had grown high all around it, and the air smelled damp, like leaves that had been sitting wet for too long. I carried my bag inside, pushing through a heavy wooden door that creaked loud enough to echo. The inside was just as worn down as the outside. Dust on the windowsills, floorboards that groaned under each step, and a faint smell like mice had been there at some point. Rusty sniffed every corner with his tail wagging, excited to claim the place. I set my bag on a chair and looked around. The living area was just one room with a small wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a couch that looked like it hadn't been sat on in years. The bedroom was small, just a bed with a thin mattress and a wooden dresser with one drawer broken. There was no power. The place had been left that way, so I unpacked a lantern and some extra batteries I had brought. The The sun was almost gone by the time I got the wood stove going. The fire snapped and hissed as it ate up the dry logs I had carried inside. Rusty stretched out in front of it, warm and content, while I sat on the couch with my jacket still zipped. The sound of the woods was different out here. Back in town, you heard the hum of cars or neighbors talking across yards. Out here, once the sun was gone, the silence sat heavy. Every sound became sharper: the crunch of leaves outside, the far-off caw of a crow, the shifting groans of the old cabin settling as the heat spread. I thought I'd sleep easily, but that first night dragged. Rusty woke me a couple of times, his ears flicking, his body lifting halfway as he stared at the door. Each time I told myself it was nothing more than a raccoon or deer outside, but my body stayed tense, waiting. The sound of twigs snapping outside carried too well in the dark, and at one point I was sure I heard boots on the porch, the creak of the old railing moving like weight was on it. Rusty growled low, his hackles up, and I sat frozen, holding the lantern and staring at the door. No knock came, no voice. After a long stretch of silence, I finally drifted back into uneasy sleep. Morning light erased some of that fear. The woods looked harmless in daylight, just trees swaying in the cold wind, leaves scattered across the yard. I stepped outside with Rusty, letting him sniff around while I stretched my arms and shook off the stiffness. That's when I noticed the porch. The dirt in front of the steps was scuffed in a way that didn't look like animal tracks. It looked more like the flattened marks of shoes, though blurred and dragged. I crouched down, studying the ground, telling myself it might have been from me coming in last night, though I knew my own steps hadn't gone that far off to the side. Rusty sniffed and whined low, circling that spot before running back to me. The day itself was calm. I walked the edge of the woods with Rusty, cooked some canned food over the stove, and even dozed on the couch for a while. But the unease didn't leave. Every time Rusty's ears twitched, I felt my body tighten. That night, the wind picked up hard. Branches scraped against the cabin walls, and the roof let out long moans as the gusts dragged across it. The fire kept us warm, but the noise outside made it hard to relax. Rusty stayed restless, pacing between the door and the window, his nails clicking against the floorboards. Around midnight, just as I was drifting, I heard it, clear, heavy steps moving across the porch. The same creak of the railing followed, sharper this time. Rusty exploded into barking. His whole body pressed against the door as he snarled and growled like he was ready to tear through it. My heart slammed. I grabbed the small hunting knife I had brought, clutching it in my hand while I held the lantern high. I didn't move closer to the door. I just stood frozen, waiting, staring at the wooden frame as Rusty barked nonstop. The steps paused, and for a long moment the only sounds were my dog's growls and the rattling of wind through the trees. Then, slowly, the porch boards groaned again, as if someone was shifting their weight away. After that, silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the couch with Rusty lying across my feet, still growling now and then when the wind hit just right. My mind spun through possibilities: hunters, squatters, some drunk who had wandered too far. But none of it made sense this deep in the woods. By morning, I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, stuffing my things back into the bag while Rusty paced the room. When I opened the door, the cold air hit me sharp, and my stomach sank as I looked down at the dirt. Clear footprints led from the trees to the porch. Heavy boots. They stopped at the steps, right where Rusty had growled the night before. I didn't waste time. I loaded the truck, calling Rusty inside, and we drove out fast, bouncing down the dirt road while I checked the mirror too often. My hands were stiff on the wheel until I reached the paved road again, the woods thinning behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I called the family friend later and told them the place needed better locks, maybe even boarding up. I didn't explain everything, only that it felt unsafe. I couldn't shake the image of those prints leading straight to the door, the thought of someone standing there in the dark, listening to us inside. Rusty had sensed it before I did, and that alone made me realize it hadn't been my imagination. The memory stayed with me long after. Every time I hear my dog growl at night now, I get that same tight feeling in my chest, the same frozen pause. I learned that silence in the woods doesn't mean you're alone. Sometimes it means the opposite. I was 35 years old the summer I decided to take some time alone in the woods. I had been living in Ohio for most of my life, but when a friend of mine offered me the chance to borrow his small cabin in northern Michigan for a few weeks, I thought it would be a good way to reset my head. It was 2009, and I had been through a rough stretch with work and relationships, and the thought of being away from people, phones, and city noise sounded almost healing. The cabin sat deep in the Hiawatha National Forest, a place filled with tall pines, long dirt roads, and lakes that looked untouched for decades. The cabin itself wasn't much, just a one-room log structure with a small kitchen area, an old wood stove, and a cot pushed against the far wall. A screened porch wrapped around one side, and there was an outhouse a few yards back in the trees. The whole place smelled of old wood and damp earth, and when I first stepped inside, I noticed mouse droppings in the corners and cobwebs thick in the rafters. It wasn't fancy, but it felt secluded, which was exactly what I wanted. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping firewood, hiking the trails, and fishing in a nearby creek. At night, I sat on the porch listening to the crickets and the wind rushing through the trees. I carried a lantern because the cabin had no electricity, and the glow of it always cast shadows that seemed to stretch and move with the flicker of the flame. I didn't think much of it. I was used to city living, but I told myself that out here the darkness was natural, nothing to worry about. Things changed on the fourth night. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or maybe a deer wandering near the cabin. But then I heard footsteps. They weren't light, scattered steps of an animal. These were slow, deliberate, and heavy. They circled the cabin once, then stopped near the porch. I lay on the cot, heart pounding, barely breathing, afraid to move. After several minutes of silence, I finally convinced myself it had been my imagination. I drifted back to sleep, though uneasily. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the ground. The dirt around the porch was soft, and sure enough, there were prints. They weren't boot prints, not clean ones anyway, but more like the worn tread of old shoes. I crouched down and studied them, my stomach tightening. Someone had been standing just a few feet away from where I slept. During the day, I tried to put it out of my head. I hiked farther than usual, brought back fish for dinner, and forced myself to believe it was a hunter or a camper passing through. But that night, when the woods grew quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept the lantern lit longer than usual, staring at the flickering shadows on the walls until I fell asleep. On the 6th night, the noise came again. This time, I heard the creak of the porch steps. Whoever it was had walked right up onto it. My heart thudded in my chest. I grabbed the axe I had been using for firewood and sat up, clutching it tight. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin door. I could hear slow breathing, faint but real. Then the knob rattled. Someone was testing it. I had locked it earlier with the old rusty latch, and for a moment I was grateful I remembered. I sat there for what felt like hours, every muscle tight, waiting for the sound to come again. But eventually, the breathing stopped, and the night went silent. I didn't sleep after that. I sat upright on the cot with the axe in my hands until dawn. When morning came, I went outside. The prints were deeper now, right on the porch. Whoever it was had stood there, only a thin wooden door separating them from me. My skin crawled as I imagined what would have happened if I hadn't latched it. I wanted to leave right then, but the cabin was a good 10 miles down a dirt road from the nearest paved route, and my old Chevy pickup had been giving me trouble even before I drove up here. I didn't know if it would even make the trip back without stalling. I told myself maybe it had been a drifter, someone passing by who wouldn't return. That evening, I kept the axe by my side and hardly moved. I ate a cold can of beans straight from the tin and barely noticed the taste. As night settled in, I blew out the lantern early, thinking maybe if the cabin looked dark, whoever it was wouldn't come back. I lay in the blackness, listening. Hours passed, and I started to think maybe it was over. But then the sound came again. This time it was different. Instead of footsteps outside, I heard a scraping at the back of the cabin, near the small window above the cot. It sounded like metal on glass. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. The scraping grew louder, as though someone was testing the frame, trying to work it open. My hands tightened around the axe handle. The window was old, only a weak latch holding it shut. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. Eventually the scraping stopped, and silence swallowed the cabin again. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I packed up what little I had. I didn't care if my truck broke down on the way back. I had to get out. When I stepped outside, I saw it. The window frame had fresh marks along the edge, long scratches where something sharp had dug into the wood. Whoever had been there had tried to pry it open. The drive out was the longest 10 miles of my life. Every bump and rattle of the truck made me think it would die right there, leaving me stranded. When I finally reached the paved road and saw a gas station in the distance, I almost cried with relief. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and just sat there shaking. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I told my friend about what happened, he admitted that others who had stayed there mentioned strange things too. Hearing footsteps, finding prints, feeling watched. Some thought it was hunters trespassing. Others said squatters used the woods. But nobody ever caught who it was. For weeks after I returned home, I couldn't sleep without checking my windows twice. I'd lie awake listening for sounds in the dark. Even now, years later, when I think back to those nights, I can still hear the slow crunch of footsteps circling the cabin and the faint rattle of the doorknob. What scared me the most wasn't what happened while I was awake, but the nights before, when I thought I had been sleeping safely. Because if they had tried the door or the window then, I might not have even known until it was too late. That's the truth about those woods. It wasn't nature that made them dangerous. It was people.